Hello and welcome back to the show 400 Years Later, a podcast that looks at Shakespeare and applies it to today. Last week, we looked at the rape of Lucrece and connected it to today's Me Too movement. Today, we're going to do a deeper dive into Ophelia of Shakespeare's Hamlet. I'm pleased today to be joined by guest Paige McLaughlin, a senior English and theater design technology double major. Paige, I ask all of my guests the same question, so I have to ask you too. Why are Shakespeare's works still important today, 400 years later?
Hey, Rachel. Thanks for having me on. Also, common mistake. I'm actually an English major, theater technology and film studies double minor. Even the theater department forgets.
Gosh,
so.
Yeah.
But yes, no, you're so right, though. Shakespeare's works are still very important, like today, 400 years later. It's almost a little infuriating because, like, people in high school get taught Shakespeare, and they're just like, wow, this really sucks. Why are we learning how to read, like, all of this crazy old-ass language? And then you get into college and, like, this class we're taking with Professor Diaz right now, and you're like, oh, no, he really is that good. So that makes it even more infuriating that I hated him in high school. But no, I think he's important still because of how much of our popular, for no reason other than how much of our popular culture he's permeated. Like, you can't read anything anymore without having a reference to, like, Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet in it. It feels like they're making a new movie, like, about Juliet, I feel like, in the coming months. Like, I think that's a thing that's happening. So if for no reason other than further pop culture, like, immersion, you should absolutely read Shakespeare. There's a bunch of literary reasons to do it too, but I'm sure that there are many people, we'll talk about some of those today, but I'm sure that there are many people who could explain that better than me.
Yeah, well, and speaking of how big of an influence Shakespeare and his works have on today's pop culture, as you briefly mentioned, no better play to look at for the source of that than Hamlet. So many phrases that we use today originating in this play. It was, of course, written in 1600, and it's one of Shakespeare's most famous works. And so that's kind of where we situate ourselves for this episode. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Hamlet, it basically follows young Hamlet, who upsettingly is 30 years old.
Yeah,
I wish he were
young
like
is very
18.
relative.
Yeah. Anyway, it follows young Hamlet who realizes after being confronted by his father's ghost that his uncle killed his father to take the crown. And now his uncle, of course, Claudius, has married his mother, Gertrude, and Hamlet pledges to his father that he'll avenge his death, and it kind of sets him on a revenge cycle that, as we know, is never fruitful and makes us question, is he sane? Is he not sane? These are questions people have been grappling with for centuries, and I don't necessarily aim to answer today. But, of course, with any of the tragedies, it ends in ruin, and Hamlet dies. Everyone dies.
Everyone dies.
Yeah, so, but the person who I left out of that brief summary is Ophelia. Paige, would you mind telling us a little bit about Ophelia's place in this tragedy?
Oh, absolutely. I would love to talk about Ophelia. So Ophelia is Hamlet's love interest, ? I say question mark because their first actual interaction in the play isn't until like halfway through, which I find so fascinating. But she is the daughter of Polonius and the sister of Laertes, who are two other big player characters in the play that I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about in relation to her. But basically, she's in love with Hamlet, and she thinks he's in love with her, or maybe he is in love with her, and maybe that's something else we'll talk about. But she is the only woman who's not Hamlet's mother in the play, really. Like everyone else, it's a very male-dominated play, so having her in here really gives us the female perspective on Hamlet's potential madness or lack thereof.
Yeah, and I saw that there's this Ophelia film that was made in 2018. It's directed by let me make sure I get this right. Yep, Claire McCarthy, and it stars Daisy Ridley as Ophelia. And I saw that on my Netflix suggested, like, next to watch list, and I started asking myself, yeah, how would this story change if Ophelia were telling it? And, you know, we have all of these new films like Disney's Cruella with Emma Stone or Maleficent with Angelina Jolie. I'm a big fan of that one, by the way. But I am such a sucker for the story being retold from a different point of view. Ophelia is obviously not the antagonist in Hamlet like Cruella or Maleficent are in their respective stories. But I feel like reimagining the tragedy from her perspective and like really putting her at the forefront of the story is not only an exercise in feminism, but also an exercise in creativity and imagination. You know, it's so fun to take a deeper dive into her character and think about how she might add more dimension to the story if we think about how she saw everything go down.
Yeah, I totally agree, because in the grand scheme of things, Ophelia's not ever, quote unquote, on screen that long in Hamlet. Like, she's there, I think, I didn't remember if it's Act 1 or Act 2, but when Laertes leaves, basically, and then she's on when she's has her confrontation with Hamlet in Act 3, Scene 1, which is the first time they ever interact with each other on screen. And then she goes mad, basically. Like, she's not in much of Hamlet at all, if you really think about it. She's mentioned a lot when she's not there, but she's just... So having that behind-the-scenes look, I'm actually very interested, now that you've mentioned that movie, to see if I can find it anywhere, because we can guess what she was doing when Hamlet was being all pondery and just all this other like melodramatic stuff about his dad, but we don't really know. So having someone interpret that, it's a very interesting idea to me.
Yeah, and I've seen so many scholars, talk about how characters like Ophelia, Lavinia, and Titus Andronicus, a lot of the women in Shakespeare's plays just really don't have much to them beyond the surface level, simply because, it's a tragedy, or they're tragedies set in the man's world. And the women are minor characters. They're never the protagonist. So some people say it's hard to even really do an analysis because they're hardly there at all. But I really appreciate this 2018 film because, now I'm just going to, disclaimer, it takes a lot of creative license. So if you're looking for a match to Hamlet, it's probably not that. But I like it because it adds so much more dimension, not only to Ophelia, but to the other women in the play. Whereas sometimes in Shakespeare, we really don't get much other than, oh, she's super pretty and she's a virgin. Great.
I'm like,
but
wow.
Now she's going to die. Boo.
Yeah.
There's so much more to everyone in the film Ophelia, which I really appreciate. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, I wanted to think about Shakespeare's Hamlet and kind of reimagine some of the key scenes that Ophelia's in, and just kind of have us discuss our own take on how they might be different if Ophelia were the protagonist.
All right. I think actually the one I want to start with is the first scene where she shows up, and I believe that's Act 1, Scene 3. And that is where she is saying goodbye to Laertes. Before he leaves for... is he leaving for England like Hamlet was? I already forget. But either way, Laertes is leaving, which, by the way, I'm also largely of the opinion that if Laertes had stayed throughout this whole exchange in Denmark, things would have played very differently. But we're not here to talk about that. But the reason that this one interests me so much is because this is the only interaction we really get with her where you get the sense of like her family dynamic and her place in this play. Like even in the scene where she and Hamlet are having their big confrontation, you don't learn that much about her, but you do learn a lot about her in this scene. Like you realize that when Laertes is warning her off of, both of her family members are warning her off of Hamlet, but they're doing it in very different ways. So Laertes is doing it like, they both have, both Laertes and Polonius have, it's like their family's reputation is on the line a little bit, but Laertes is almost, he's like, I fear for you. Like, bad things could happen to you if you get involved with him. Like, yes, reputation is important, but he just wants his sister to, like, be happy with whoever she's with also. I think that I think she says, it's like, when he gives her his warning, she's like, "'Tis in my memory locked, and you yourself shall keep the key of it." Like, she's trusting him, like the advice that he's giving her, she's like, "Yes, I will lock it in my memory, I will treasure it." And then when Polonius warns her off in the same manner, but he's like, "Oh, it's all about like your chastity and your reputation and such," she goes on to say, "I shall obey my lord." She doesn't call him father. She's not. She's like, "Well, you're my dad. This is a patriarchy. I have to obey." So you've got this, like, obviously, like, if Polonius wasn't around, maybe Laertes would have had more of an investment in something like that. We don't really know. But you do learn later on when he comes home and finds her mad and raving that he does care about her. And I think that the dynamic between that family setup in this scene is so important. So I'm actually interested to see how that would be interpreted in the movie that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, so actually, one of the only bad things that I have to say about the film is it's not explored as much as I wish it were. There's so much on Ophelia's relationship with Hamlet, and the film portrays it as true love. Neither of them are mad. You know, they're just kind of like a Romeo and Juliet situation. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of scenes involving Ophelia or Polonius and Laertes together. In fact, the opening scene is Ophelia as a little girl interrupting court. And Gertrude is like, "Who is this scruffy little girl? I'll take her up. She's clearly motherless. Like, I'll raise her as a lady of the court." And so that's where the movie really takes off, but we don't see like anything of Polonius up until the point where there's a similar situation where he comes to Ophelia and says, "Hey, I know you've been hanging around this Hamlet guy." Oddly, though, in the film, he's like, "I love it. You know, I'm power seeking. I want to be on the top with the king. I love it. Like, get as close to Hamlet as you can. That's going to elevate our family." So it's a very different.
That's very different. Like that, like the out of your star line doesn't happen in that version. That's crazy.
Yes, and it's almost annoying because he's like almost entirely absent from the film up until that point. Like, you just assume Ophelia is being raised by the women of the court.
Yeah, by Gertrude and the rest,
right, exactly. So, and then he just pops in all of a sudden. He's like, "Yeah,
I've been your dad all along."
Yes, I've been here. I like Hamlet. So, I mean, it's still self-serving in that way. Like, he's trying to, you know, in the play, as you said, they're trying to preserve their reputation. But in the film, I feel like he's trying to build up their reputation even more by giving them some royal connections. But so it's a lot different. And as far as Ophelia's relationship with Laertes, again, it's underdeveloped in my opinion, which is a flaw to the film. But there is that closeness that I feel they have in the play that you just kind of spoke on. Her saying, like, "I'll lock that into my memory. You have the key." It seems like they're better friends. Not that someone has to be friends with their dad, but I'm just saying they obviously have a closer relationship than she does to Polonius, at least in my point of view. And that is portrayed at a bare minimum in the film.
Oh, man, that's too bad. Because that's really what sold Laertes for me as like a decent guy, was that how much he actually cared about Ophelia. Because you see it here and you see it. Because I'm like, oh man, if he doesn't have that, then he doesn't have much to him aside from just being like a generic antagonist to Hamlet.
Right.
Like another guy who is in line for the throne because Hamlet kind of got screwed over for it.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Ophelia's relationship to them. But also, one thing that I found almost overwhelming in the film version is Ophelia's relationship to Gertrude. As I said, like, Gertrude kind of takes her up as a mother, which in the tragedy, I feel like, in my opinion, when I read the tragedy, I felt like all of Gertrude's remarks about Ophelia are kind of backhanded. Like, once Ophelia's, spoiler alert, dead, and Gertrude says something along the lines of, "Oh, I was supposed to be spreading flowers on your marriage bed, not on your grave." I can't help but be like, that's so fake, you know. In my opinion, you don't see much sympathy for Ophelia from Gertrude preceding that. Whereas in the film, they have a very close relationship, but Ophelia knows that Gertrude has been unfaithful even before the king's death. So that's where a lot of the tension in the film comes in. And there's like a random witch sister.
Oh, of course. Random
As
witches
one
are always
does.
fun.
Right. So, I mean, that adds some complexity to it. But that's really a relationship that is developed in the film a lot that maybe is not developed in the tragedy.
That's so funny to me because I was talking with my playwriting professor just yesterday, and we brought up Hamlet. I don't remember why. But he mentions that it's so interesting that Gertrude is not only the one who finds Ophelia in Hamlet, because that's true in the actual play text. Gertrude's the one who tells everyone that that Ophelia is dead, and she's found her drowned. But she talks about how long it took her to drown. So what was she doing there? And I'm like, oh my God, that's not a question that's ever come to mind. I never thought about that before. Because I did think it was weird. I'm like, wow, Gertrude had no relationship with her. Why didn't Laertes find her? Or why didn't Hamlet find her? And then it's just like, oh, she's like, oh no, all this terrible things. I watched how long it took her to like suffocate. And we're like, what? Why? Why did you do that? And I'd never thought about that, and it's blowing my mind. I hate that I only discovered this yesterday, and we didn't talk about that in class. I might need to talk to Professor Diaz about that.
Yeah, that is troubling, isn't it?
Yeah.
She really could have saved her, or at least gotten someone
exactly.
to help. But...
She's just like, oh no, I'm going to watch her drown for half an hour, and then I'm going to go talk to everyone I know and be like, oh my God, I could have saved her, but I didn't.
Yeah, that's... Ooh, gives me the chills.
Yeah, that's so weird. I don't care for that. That's so strange. But the context you mentioned, because does she die in the movie still? Like,
well, so can I spoil it?
Yeah, I don't care.
Okay, so the witch teaches Ophelia how to basically escape death by taking this potion. I think it's like 3 drops, and then if you like die, you'll resurrect in like 5 minutes. So she takes like a little potion and then drowns, and she's buried, but Horatio like digs her up and she's alive.
Oh man.
If you like reasonableness, you may not like the film, but I enjoyed it. But anyway, in the film version, Gertrude does still find Ophelia, and because of that intensified mother-daughter type of relationship they have, it's kind of heartbreaking. Like, the guards are holding her back as she's trying to, like, go into the water and save her.
Oh, okay.
But as far as we know, that's not happening here in the tragedy.
No, see, as far
I get the vibe that she's, like, pulling out popcorn and watching it happen.
Yeah, she's just like, man, I watched as such and such came around. I'm like, Gertrude, was someone holding you back? Were you drowning, Ophelia? What's happening?
Right.
Like, we'll never know. We'll never know, and it's upsetting. Shakespeare, come back from the dead and tell us what you meant.
That would be nice. I feel like if he came back from the dead, he'd have, like, answers for everything.
Yeah. We'd be like, all right, we know you're maybe only here for, like, so long. We have to take you to every Shakespeare scholar that's ever existed.
Yes. Another part, another scene that portrays Ophelia differently, and it's not just in the film. I've read lots of scholarly work and watched reviews on just the tragedy itself that kind of questions the way we interpret the scene of Ophelia, like her final act, before drowning, like handing out the flowers to everybody at court. And, it's kind of, on a first read, you're like, oh, she's crazy. Like, here she is handing out flowers, like singing, running around. It's kind of, just a display of maybe her madness. But when you really look into what the flowers represent and who she's giving each specific flower, it kind of makes me wonder if Ophelia, even in the tragedy, even in Shakespeare's version, is like, standing up for herself and for justice, because we see her give rosemary and pansies to Laertes, her brother. These apparently represent remembrance. She gives rue to Gertrude, which symbolizes repentance, regret, bitterness. Ouch.
Yeah. Maybe she's like, you should regret. You should regret what you're about to do to me.
She's like, I know what's to come. And then she, of course, gives Fenwal and Columbine to Claudius, which symbolizes flattery and adultery. And she saves the daisies for herself, which interestingly represent chastity and humility and innocence. And I don't know, I think that's very telling of her character, and it's a scene that maybe we don't think about enough. And I feel like that's somewhere, even in Shakespeare's text, where we see her agency shine through, even for a split moment. You always picture all of the women characters, well, at least most of them. I mean, we've got Tamara.
That's true.
Being like complicit and not really, lacking agency. And I feel like that's a key moment where Ophelia, whatever version it is, you could interpret her as, standing up for herself and saying, I know what happened and you're not innocent for it. The rest of you aren't innocent for it.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I really think it's interesting that you said like what she gave to Laertes is for remembrance, because she told him that only he would have the key to. She's like, I will lock it in my memory, and oh my God, that's such a great. I didn't even think about. Yeah, that's crazy. But yeah, all the rest of those make sense. And I noticed you also put that the violets all withered when Polonius died, like wisdom and faithfulness. I kind of hate that as well, because it kind of implies she's like, you were right all along, Father. He never did love me. But I don't know. I think Hamlet did. I think he did love her. Now, I don't know if I think he loved her as much as he loved Horatio, for example. Right. I think he and Horatio were far closer, but it's one of those things where it's a bit of a melancholy thing there as well. But I think that's an excellent way to look at this. You're right. It's not something I'd ever thought about before. So I totally agree that it's looking into those, like the language of flowers or whatever, really enhances the scene.
I feel like it's her finally sticking it to the man, like saying,
she's like,
I know what you've done.
She's like, I may be mad, but there's method in it.
Yes, method in the madness. True. Well, I feel like we can't talk about Ophelia and her character without talking about the scene where Hamlet utters the lines, "Get thee to a nunnery."
Oh, Hamlet, you poor, witty and bitter soul, you.
So I know in class we talked about, there's a few possibilities to it, or a few different avenues that you could interpret these lines. Where did you kind of fall on that spectrum of, is Hamlet being sincere and protective, or is he really just a misogynistic asshole?
So, unfortunately, I think it's both. Now, I will say, I am of the opinion that Hamlet is not mad. I think he gets a little lost in playing madness. I think he's better at it than he thinks he is. He's like, oh, I could never play such emotion as well as these players. I'm like, buddy, you're doing just fine. Shut up. You're doing just fine. Shut your mouth. But I think in this particular situation, he is trying to keep Ophelia out of it, because I think he's like, I think he knows that Polonius and Claudius are trying to get to him through Ophelia. I don't know if he knows how involved she is by this point, because at this point they've explicitly asked her to be like, go talk to Hamlet. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if he knows that. I think he is fully aware that they will try and use her to get to him. So I think that in that way of looking at it, I do think he is doing it out of he's doing it very poorly. I want to clarify. Don't treat people this way.
Right.
But I think he is doing it out of a place of care for her, because also if she does heed his advice, if she's so woefully distraught and she does go to a nunnery, she's out of the picture. She gets to keep her chastity. She gets to, because he doesn't know if he's going to live through this either at this point. Like, because he has the to be or not to be speech before this, like right before this, like when he's debating like ending his own life. So it's like at that point, it's like he doesn't want her to get involved in the plot, and he doesn't want to have her watch him potentially die as well. So I think that having those two scenes that close together does lend a little more credence to the he cares about her theory. That said, again, this is a very patriarchal play. There's all the characters pretty much are like, there's something that they have ambition for the most part, that they want to keep. And I think that, unfortunately, that mindset, as maybe even if it doesn't affect him as much as it affects some of the other people, at least as blatantly, it's still the society and the people he grew up around. And as such, part of him does probably believe the misogynistic stuff he's saying. I think it's more out of a place of care. That said, he's a right dick here. Like, again, don't treat people this way. Don't tell people to go to a nunnery and like malign them for being women. Don't do that. Just be nice.
Yeah, exactly. And for some of the viewers who may not know the connection, nunnery could also in this context mean brothel. So if you read it a different way, it might be Hamlet saying, you know, you're just like every other woman. You're like my cheating, scheming mother. You might as well go to a brothel. Yeah. So there's a doubleness to it. Interestingly, in the film, this is another adaptation that they really explore deeply, is Gertrude has a sister who is a witch. That's not a spoiler. And they grow up in a nunnery, and they're partially raised by nuns. So in this scene, Hamlet is basically saying, coming from a protective place and saying, you know, it's not safe here anymore. You should go to the nunnery.
The
nunnery,
like
where
the
Gertrude
nunnery.
was. Yes, so that she'll be safe. Which, I don't know, if you're going to go, you know, to all that measure, I guess I enjoyed it and I liked that. But it really, like I said, it's not super true to the text itself. So if that's what you're looking for, you might not like the film. But I felt like the changes they made, they executed decently well.
Yeah. I was going to say, the way you've said it, it sounds like because of how much they've changed, they were able to execute whatever plan they were going for decently well.
Yes, definitely. And the film is titled Ophelia. It's obviously very much about Ophelia, but I would say it's just as much about Gertrude.
And I'm so glad that you've been talking about, because I wrote about Gertrude for the most recent paper we did. Gertrude and King Hamlet before, the dead man. But I think that Gertrude is such an interesting character because almost all of her lines are to Hamlet or about Hamlet. Like, there's almost, until Ophelia dies, there's not a lot of points in the play where she's not specifically talking about her son and how worried she is for him and how much she wishes he could move on because she loves him. And I think it's so interesting to look at that in comparison to this scene where Hamlet's actions towards Ophelia are so dramatically contrasted with him in the rest of the play because he's so slow and methodical and hesitant to do anything. Like, he's like, maybe I shouldn't stab the king. Maybe my grief just means I should kill myself. Maybe I won't be able to avenge my father. Why did the ghost give it to Hamlet? Who the fuck knows? But I think that Gertrude shapes Hamlet more than his father does, even in this regard, because we learn that Gertrude's inaction is what is bothering Hamlet. Like, the fact that she was just willing to get married to his uncle, the fact that she was willing to move on so quickly. And he's so inactive isn't quite the right, but like his inaction on what his father has given him to do. Like, in that respect, he's more like her than I think he would readily admit. And the fact that he takes such drastic action with Ophelia here is really interesting to me because he's waffled for so long on everything else except this, the first interaction he has with her. And so it's so drastically different with how he's doing everything else. And I think that that's an interest, and that's more like a comparison of Gertrude and Hamlet specifically. But you mentioned in the movie that Gertrude, she's a very active character because of how she factors into Ophelia's life. And I think that that's another difference from this, where it's like, whether it's because Hamlet, like, I know we're not reading it from his perspective, but he's a bit of an unreliable narrator in that sense. So if we're not seeing it all, but we do see that she doesn't offer a lot in ways of action towards furthering the plot of the play, except for the scene and when Hamlet comes to her quarters and he's like, don't you see my dead father? I'm going to berate you for everything you've ever done. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I just think it's so interesting that she's such a prominent character there. And she's just, to put it for lack of a better, she's not prominent here. Like, she's here, but she's not ever going to be the first person you look at when you read this play.
Yeah, no. And so that's what I really liked about the film is they kind of bring her to the forefront and really look at her relationship not only to Ophelia, but to Hamlet, to Claudius, before and after the king's murder. So, yeah, overall, I felt that the movie was a nice adaptation. Like I said, it does not necessarily stick to the text, but the liberties it takes really end up in nice storytelling. And, you know, pretty much everyone dies except Ophelia. And because she's
Horatio,
telling the story. The movie begins, this is my telling of the story. And
like,
so she has a happily ever after, sort of.
You said Horatio was still alive, too? He was the one who dug her out of the grave or whatever? Or does Horatio die in this scenario as well? That's not acceptable.
You know what? He might be alive as well.
You know what?
Okay, so everyone except Horatio.
You know what? That's okay. Horatio can live. He was a good dude.
Yes, and you know what? He's pretty developed in the movie, too.
Oh, props.
Obviously,
Amazing.
the movie only follows scenes that, like, Ophelia is a part of.
Yeah.
So we miss out on, you know, the bromance between him and Hamlet, but he's still a principal character in the movie with his relationship to Ophelia, actually.
Amazing.
But yeah, so I would recommend it. It's a pretty good adaptation. So anyway, I feel like we could sit and talk all afternoon about Hamlet. Like, I'm on a roll now.
Say, people could teach whole classes about Hamlet, for
Yeah.
real. Like, I started yelling about things that aren't even about Ophelia. I yelled about Gertrude for 5 minutes. Like, it's fine. Everything is great. But yeah, honestly.
It's hard not to. They're all so interconnected.
Yeah, and it really is. And for those of you who want to read Hamlet, and I highly recommend you do, even if you're not an English or a theater major, because of, again, how ingrained so many of the, like, even just, like, singular line. I mean, granted, a lot of them are taken out of context in today's society. Like, yeah, like, the out of your star quote I mentioned, for example, is, like, the most boring scene that has ever existed. And you're just like, wow, okay, that's fun. But read it, like, have someone read it to you and you follow along, because I feel like if you try and read it, like, just by yourself, you're going to get a little lost in all of, like, the Middle English or whatever this technically is considered language. But it's really solidly written. There's a reason we still do so many adaptations of it. It's probably objectively, and that's saying a lot, and people are going to fight me for saying that, but I think it is objectively Shakespeare's best work, and I've read a lot of them. There are some characters, like more side characters in some of his other works that I think are done better. But as far as following, like, the titular protagonist Hamlet, and as far as, like, following through on his story, I think that this is the most developed character Shakespeare's written by far. Hamlet is, and the fact that I am invested in him the whole way through, even when he infuriates me. I want, like, you know how it's going to end. It's a revenge tragedy. You know how it's going to end. And you don't care, because that's not what's important. That's not what's important leading up to it. Like the love, the betrayal, like, all that stuff. And Romeo and Juliet's the same way, by the way. If you're like, oh, the teenagers are dumb, it's like, yeah, they're dumb. You know they're going to die at the end. But the fact that the love is there is what's important. Like, the fact that they are, like, the story that they are telling before they get there is important. So the same thing is true of Hamlet, and probably even more so. So read Hamlet, or have someone online or in person read it to you, and, like, just go through it once or twice and see what you notice, because it really is pretty excellent.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And once you read Hamlet, watch Ophelia and see how you feel, see how you think differently of the play. It's really a worthwhile movie. It's not super long. It's very well directed. All of the acting is phenomenal. There's George McKay. Need I say more?
Yeah,
I'm in love with him.
Yeah,
anyway.
There you go. That's amazing. Or just rewatch The Lion King again if you want an Hamlet adaptation.
Yeah.
Not the new one, the old one.
Agreed.
But
Agreed on that. Yeah. All right. Well, I feel like that was a very fruitful conversation. I'm glad to have had you here today, Paige.
Yeah, it was
I knew you would be a great guest. I thought it was super fun.
Yeah, I had a really great time.
Well, all right. That was super exciting. Like we said, take a look into Hamlet, see how you are able to connect it to today's issues and gender relations. And of course, check back with us next week as the episode will be focused on Othello. All right. As always, thank you to our guest, Paige McLaughlin, and thank you to Professor Diaz. Bye.